Hello and welcome to the Love, Creativity, Justice podcast. This episode, we are joined by Christian and Christina Gonzalez-Ho. Christina is a writer, musician, and worship leader. She holds a BA in Comparative Literature from Stanford University and a JD from Harvard Law School. Her writing has been published in Image Journal, Between Lands, and Ecstasis, and her audio series, The Last 2 Years, is on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Christian works as a cultural theorist, art historian, curator, and architectural designer. He is a PhD candidate in art history at Stanford University, researching the relationships among art, architecture, epistemology, and spirituality. He holds an MA in architecture from Harvard University and a BA in American Studies from Fordham University. All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Love, Creativity, Justice podcast created by Expression 58. My name is Caleb Zook, and today we are joined by Christian and Christina Gonzalez-Ho. So how are you guys doing today?
Good.
Good.
Yeah. Have a nice day. LOL too.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited for this. I just have so much respect for you guys. I know you have such a deep well of knowledge in a lot of different areas. And I think we're going to go to some interesting places because our first question being as broad as it is, I think we're going to start with talking about what is artistry, what is an artist, and kind of their role in society. Just start very broad, and then we'll dive into that. So, from your guys' perspective and research, what is an artist at kind of a base level?
So my work is in studying art history, but specifically my interest is in how a culture defines art and its artists, and then what function does it have within a particular culture, because it's not the same for every culture, and I think that's an important thing to recognize. So when we use these broad terms, we think like museums are kind of just like the norm, but they aren't. They're a very specific sort of construction. So when we talk about what is art, it's a good question to begin with, because I think we have to recognize where a lot of our assumptions are coming from. So what I would say, though, is that I think there is a common function in which I would say that art operates as language for people. So in the same way that, we are communicating, and so we've developed this series of sounds that has meaning and is attached to whether it's symbols or pictographs or whatever. This constitutes how we communicate, and so art constitutes how individuals communicate with themselves, so internally. Because if you think thoughts to yourselves, once you develop the language mechanism that pre-exists, you're having to develop it. You're able to communicate with yourself. When there are case studies, when people lose language, so in strokes and things like that, and like their languaging centers, because they lose that capacity, they also lose the capacity to communicate and recognize themselves, who they are, basic kind of facts or whatever. But we store all these facts from the moment you wake up and open your eyes, your dreams, whatever, it never turns off. We store these things in a system of language. And so art is a very powerful part of that system of language, and it bridges the individual with themselves, this like internal self. Some people would call it the soul or the spirit, or the subconscious and the conscious. So internally, there's an ecology which art functions to connect us with, but then the external function would be from one self to another self, another subjectivity, human, non-human, and then with the cosmos. So with spiritual realities, with the larger forces and powers at play. We as Christians would say like it can be, we in scripture and in history, we can see it operating in all kinds of different ways. You can be communicating with demons, angels, God, etc. So spiritual reality, and that's, in short, I would say art is the mechanism, art is the means of language by which we communicate with ourselves, others, and the world around us, or the cosmos. And that being like God. The technical word I use is the numinous, or the spiritual, but yeah, I think that's a role of art. And the role of the artist is to be that intermediary, to be able to create objects or songs or whatever. They in themselves internalize this connectedness, and then they produce, we'll say objects to make it simpler, but they produce objects, whether visual objects, sonic objects, whatever.
Or actions.
Or action, series of actions. They create platforms, let's put it that way. They create platforms, and those platforms can be material or immaterial. And those platforms enable us to engage with those three categories: the numinous, gods, the cosmos, others, non-human, human, and then ourselves.
I think throughout history, artists and priests have been one function, right? Like, like from earliest human history up until, I don't know when you would say the split happened, but it was understood that the role of the priest or the shaman, or, you know, whatever, that the spiritual intermediary and the artist were the same thing. And maybe that function was like even more widespread in communities in which spirituality was much more interwoven with everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, that's a big term for the artist is a priest and continues to function as such in today's society, whether that kind of language has been, whether a culture would embrace that kind of language or not. And the culture I'm referring to is the West. Like, people in the West do not like talking about like priests, and the idea that their form of artistry is something other than like intellectually and emotionally driven and connects with this other thing. Now it's becoming more popular, but and more accepted, but like 20 years ago, nobody would want to like even say that. And even still, in like I'm mostly, let me preface this, sorry, I'm talking about the visual art world. So contemporary visual arts, what you would see if you go to if you're in LA, the MoCA, the LACMA; in New York, the MoMA, the Met, etc. Sorry, this is a really long, but it is a big question.
Great. This is great.
A way for us to start.
Yeah. Do you think, Christina, with what you were talking about, do you think that split between priest and artist, are they still together, or was there a split where they kind of were broken apart and now they're finding their way back together? How has that kind of shaped throughout time?
Well, I don't think that there's ever been an actual split in terms of what an artist is doing. You know, what an artist is doing now is the same as what an artist has always been doing, is the same as there's never been any change. You know, like when real art is created, and, you know, it's not that I have like a very specific definition for like this constitutes real art and this isn't, but I think that different people can kind of feel it when like someone creates a work of art versus a work of propaganda, or at least we like to believe that we can tell the difference. But I think anytime that art is happening, there is that priestly thing happening, you know, like the artist is acting as this mediator, creating these portals to the unseen, and whether that's a psychological place, an emotional place, a spiritual place, and you know, or all three,
Political place, like
right, like that is what art is. And so the function of the artist and the priest has never actually like, you know, split off. But I think that in our minds today, we think of them as very different things.
Our viewpoint of them, our observation of them, I guess. But their role, their specific role underneath has never changed.
Yes.
Much of that would, well, in the West, much of that would have to do with the Protestant Reformation, because the Protestant Reformation really created this division between art. For example, basically, if you had art in a church, it would get torn out if it was thought to create any sort of affective response, meaning like if you saw it, you would be liable to worship it or worship through it, or like if your emotions would kick in if you saw this piece of artwork, or if it was thought that that's what would happen, then in general, within the Protestant Reformation, you would remove that piece of artwork and it would either get destroyed, or a Catholic patron would then take it and be like, and save it. And so really in the Reformation is where you get this there, and there are actually like documents like going about describing whether a piece of art is neutral or not. So if it's neutral, it can stay. And if it's didactic, it can stay in the church. But it has to be very specifically didactic, and it can't be too, can't take too many creative liberties. And that's how it can stay in a Protestant church. And you know, someone like, I think it's Zwingli said, I love white walls. White walls are beautiful to me. I don't need art, you know, basically, you know, and he's a reformer he's like one of the major reformers along with Calvin and Luther. And so you do have this thing where the Reformation is saying art can only serve to teach you something very specific about theology, but it cannot engage your emotions. And if it does so, then like that's not cool, and it doesn't belong in the church. And it's I'm doing some research on it now. It's a very interesting split, but I would say that's where you have this major split from art has to be extremely intellectual, and it has to be doing it has to be, yeah, that's the Reformation reaching out from the grave to approve. And it has to be serving a particular functional purpose. It cannot just be sitting around and engaging your emotions and potentially leading you astray through your emotions.
And do you think like a lot of that carries all the way to today and how the church views certain art?
I mean, yeah, 100%. I think it's like both, but it's both the church and the art world. So, for example, the reason why the art world gets very uncomfortable using spiritual language is because of this heritage, this Protestant heritage. They would say, no way, we're like totally secular. We don't have any sort of, we don't ascribe to any sort of religious practice. But the fact is that our culture has been deeply imprinted by these kinds of patterns and ways of seeing. And so the discussion around the spirituality of art has always existed in the Western world. You can go to the surrealists, you know, there's plenty of, I mean, there's outside of that, there's plenty of artists who have created from a spiritual place. But to be able to say those things in public, that's a different thing. In the church, I would say the way it manifests is kind of the reverse. There's both this like, I mean, I've worked with churches a couple of times. Either the art has to be, yeah, I think you see the same thing. The art has to be like extremely didactic. It has to be telling you exactly what you want it to say. And there can't be any gray zone. So for example, I'm going to try to be broad and not get too, but I don't know, a lion, right? Like a lion in a evangelical charismatic church means very specific things. So if we're looking at a lion, totally cool, that's fine. I'm okay with that, you know, or we're looking at, I don't know, fire or a dove, a cross, even these things are very they're useful because they have very particular meanings. We all agree on those meanings and we don't have to question those meanings. The problem with that is art, I think when you're talking about a priestly function, it brings us into the presence of things we don't quite understand. So when you read Revelation or you read about encounters with angels and stuff like that prophets have, they're entering into spaces that they don't quite understand. They're given like some clarity for sure. But even in scripture, like Daniel's not really sure what he's seeing. John's not really sure what he's seeing. There are many, when Mary is given prophecies, it says she holds them in her heart. She doesn't quite understand what they are. But in the Christian world, because of the Reformation's kind of relationship with it, Protestants, the art has to be explicit and very clear. And if you don't have clarity, then you have to do it. So you have to do it on your own time somewhere else. But people don't realize that's not the way things are. That's just the result of a very politically charged situation from the 1500s. If you go to the Catholic Church, you'll have very emotional scenes of people getting, flayed alive, like right next to where you're worshiping, right? Like you're looking at these pieces and they're extremely, like, they incorporate the body all the time. You're seeing like the martyrs and symbolism of like how they were tortured and murdered, and you're seeing that on a daily and weekly basis, if you're a parishioner of these places. And so the role of art becomes, for the Catholic Church, is deeply affective, meaning it's always both engaging with theology and your emotions and the history of the church. Whereas Protestants, they kind of do away with the history because they just think that, like, as long as you have thinking the right things, and that's what's fine. And it has to be very clear thinking.
I think for the Protestant church, art is still very much about communicating right beliefs, communicating the right information. And that, I think that goes for whether it's music, whether it's film, whether it's visual art, anything, right? It's like you want to make sure that the Christian message is very clear and that the conclusion is like, it's exactly this. You don't have Christian films with like ambiguous conclusions or ambiguous meanings that are left up to interpretation. And I think in the Catholic Church and Orthodox churches, art has a very, it is very tied to worship in a different way, in a totally different way. Like it's a devotional, art is devotional, but it's not as didactic. So it's just an interesting difference that we have. And I think that in the Protestant church, that type of engagement with art really strips it of a lot of its power, which is why you hear complaints about Christian art all the time.
Yeah, well, this brings up, I don't want to ask a very silly question because it's not necessarily about getting to the answer, but is there taking all of this and the history behind things, and looking at where we are right now as people of faith, artists and people of faith, is there a right way to do art? Which is a silly question, but is there like ways to kind of discern how to do certain things, what not to do, learning from past mistakes? How do you view that type of thing, knowing a lot of the history behind where we've been, where we've come from, and now looking into the culture and society that we live in now? Do you see any patterns or things that we're not doing right, things that we are doing right, things that we need to be doing to incorporate more into our art?
Are you talking about, by doing art, are you talking about making art or engaging with it as a...
I guess I would more so asking from the perspective of like creating, like the creation of art, or the act of going about, like what types of art we are creating and the types of things that we are talking about in more of like a modern context.
I mean, I have a few thoughts. Do you?
Yeah.
So I think when it comes to, then this is very specifically to like Christians in the Protestant and maybe evangelical-ish space who are thinking about art and doing art, because I think that's probably mostly who'll be listening to this. I think that, yeah, one thing to be careful of is like instrumentalizing our art. So, you know, feeling like, yeah, my art has to be, it has to be glorifying to God. It has to, show the world how true Christianity is and how awesome God is. And it has to be my testimony. I think those are all like instrumentalizing our art. And those things, like my art may do those exact things. But if I'm always trying to funnel my art through the lens of like, okay, this has to like show how good God is, and it has to show how right Christianity is, then yeah, I don't think that I'm really allowing myself to fully enter into the process of creating art, because I've already decided what I want it to do. And I think that when you're making art, you can't be in control of the process in that way. You have to, you do have to partner with it, but that means that you give up a measure or maybe a ton of your control and what you think or want the outcome to be, and you kind of like give yourself to that journey and to that process. And you have to be able to be very honest, and you have to be able to be very vulnerable. And if we're honest and if we're vulnerable and if we've lived through any life at all, there's no way that we can always be saying how good God is and how right Christianity is and how heartwarming and uplifting the world is, because I don't think that's true to anyone's experience who's lived longer than like a year on Earth.
It's a portion of the experience, not necessarily the whole
portion of the
experience.
experience. Yeah. And yeah, I think that when we decide like, okay, like it whatever the case, like it has to have a Christian message, it has to have the right message, then even when we do feature like pain and suffering and difficulty in our art, it's always just a means to an end. It's like, well, I was in a really bad place, but then God came, and it just all becomes like, oh, I'm sharing my testimony in church, which I think is very different than creating art. I think the purpose of sharing a testimony is to encourage and to, show how God like showed up in your life and turned things around. But I think art sometimes does that, and sometimes it totally doesn't at all. And we need to be okay with letting it go where it goes, and letting it be ambiguous, and letting it maybe not teach such a good Sunday school lesson about Christianity, and to allow it to make ourselves and others uncomfortable. Like if you go into a museum, you'll see many things that make you uncomfortable. And a lot of Christians will write that off as like, well, that's because it's demonic. Like I've been in a lot of Christian settings where it's like any type of art that I don't understand, or that features any sort of violence or like dark ideas, it's demonic. And I don't think that we can be so quick to jump to those conclusions, because sometimes there's demonic elements at play, and sometimes it's just a very honest and unvarnished grappling with the realities of life. So anyway, that's one of my things that I would say, is that if you want to actually engage, rightly with art, then you got to let go. You got to let go of control, and you have to let go of your outcome and not instrumentalize it.
Yeah. And I think that the idea of a right way would be contingent on the individual and what they're doing. Each individual is going to have a capacity for a different sort of level of communication, right? If you like to bring it back to, verbal communication, everyone has their own accent, everybody has their own intonations and their own histrionics when they communicate. And we know that most of communication exists within those the non-literal components. So not the words, but the way the words are spoken and the disposition when they're delivered. So I think that you need to be true to those things. And when somebody, whenever you talk to somebody and they have like a fake accent and a fake attitude,
You
which,
never meet people like that in LA,
yeah,
I'm
not in
sure.
LA.
Oh, never.
don't exist. You just automatically are like, yeah, you're not really present. So why am I going to be present? However, on the other hand, if you have somebody who their entire affect and comportment is such that that you're actually communicating with them, with their heart, that everything that's happening in that exchange when they speak, in all the dimensions that encompass speech, is acting as a portal to their own heart, mind, and spirit. When that's happening, you have very real conversations. And if one person is doing that, then you, who are on the other end of this dialogue, you then kind of like reflect that and you start opening yourself up. And I think this is the nature of work. If work is about production and producing something that is effective or marketable, then it's always going to sound kind of like, like these AI productions, like you tell an AI, these music AI things to like produce something that sounds like a gospel song. You give it all these inputs, and I've heard some of them, and they're just awful. They sound like a little bit of Kirk Franklin, a little bit of Tasha Cobbs, and then they like literally Frankenstein lyrics and improve on them in the way that it does. But unfortunately, I think in the attempt to be right, in the attempt to be accurate or whatever, to fit inside of the community, people wind up suppressing their own voices and their own capacity. And so what you have is not art, but just propaganda, meaning you saying what you think you're supposed to say. But if art is a process, then you don't know where it's going to go. Like as an actor and a director, I used to lead a lot of improv, and everybody knows like the first law of improv is to say yes and, but you would be enacting the reverse, right? If you know exactly what you're going to say, you're going to be saying no all the time. You're going to say no, and this is how we're going to do it. And that's what I feel when you look at a lot of, not just Christian art. I mean, look, just because we're thinking about it right now, if you look at Drake, right? It's like, no, and I'm going to make this popular, Yeah, sorry. I'm not a fan.
No, it's good.
But, I think, I mean, just to get a little bit more, they were at Most Def, I'm forgetting his name, but he was talking about how like Drake's music is like music you would shop to or be in Target with. And we all know what that sounds like. And it's produced to elicit very particular responses. It's not produced to elicit like thoughtful responses or critical responses. And it's not that art has to do it. And thereby I'm saying like, this isn't artwork, because again, when you out of context, you walk into a museum, somebody like Peter Paul Rubens, who's super famous from the 16th 17th century, a lot of people know his work, and nobody would think to not call it art. But he was like a very great capitalist. He would be the equivalent of Drake at his time. Like he knew exactly what kind of pigments to use. He knew what was popular. He knew what his patrons wanted to see, and like he would paint it. Caravaggio, on the other hand, was a really like unorthodox character, and he was doing things that some people were doing. He drew from lineage, but he was really innovating like different things all the time. And I think like that there's a profound difference when you see their work, and there's a profound affective difference. Rubens is very technical, and there's a lot of stuff you can appreciate about his work, but when you stand in front of a Caravaggio, especially something like The Taking of Christ or The Incredulity of Thomas, like there's something really, really powerful. Or to take a contemporary example, Nathaniel Mary Quinn, his work, when you stand in front of it, we had a group of actually pastors from E58 and a couple other places, they just stood in front of his work for had them stand in front of his work for 5 minutes, and they were deeply affected because his work is coming from this risk place that Christine is talking about, where you're not putting a limit on what's possible or what's coming through you. You're just kind of like allowing it to do so.
Yeah, I definitely want to go into that a little bit more, talking about, I think, artists, especially, not that it didn't happen in the past, but I think it's happening a lot more with how much information is being shared, but artists kind of being not forced into a box, but also like oftentimes finding themselves in that box due to certain trends or, again, virality or things like that. They just kind of hop on because it works. But I did want to ask one, again, potentially another silly question. We've been talking about language as like a foundational building block of communication, or art as language and communication. I wanted to ask, does a culture and does a society work without art? Like, what happens if the artists are not doing art, if we're not communicating in that way? What happens?
I don't think we know. I don't think there's ever been a society without art.
Yeah, I don't think that would be, you'd have to have like not human beings, because like anytime you speak, right? Anytime you speak, the accent that emerges, or like in the West, we have very specific ideas of what art is and is not. Less people are sure about the is not part, although they feel it. They do have very particular feelings on what it is. And when you go to other societies, they don't even have a word that that means art. So, for example, I'm doing some research on, and I'm not an authority by any means, but I'm looking at some indigenous cultures, and they don't have this term art. I was doing this study on MAM, people in Mayan indigenous community in Guatemala. And that word is not, it's just, I was talking to a mom activist the other day, and he was like, yeah, we don't have that word. It's just, and from an outsider, from a research perspective, I'm looking at their textiles and their the wall paintings that exist, and looking at it as art, but they don't even understand it in this way.
It just exists.
It just is. It's how
Yeah.
you are in the world. And I would say that is how we are in the world. This split is part of the Reformation, and it's part of capitalism. Because like, if you can identify something and then say, oh, this is really special, because then you can make it more valuable. And in making it more valuable, you are able to capitalize on it. And that's not the only reason. I'm not saying like capitalism is the only reason that we have this, but it is a very big driver for creating this split, and why it's even possible for us to conceive of art as existing outside of society. That goes right back to that split I was talking about in the Reformation. Like, you never had churches or sacred spaces that didn't have art in them. Like, it just wasn't a thing. And then until this idea that, well, we have to go back to the Word of God, and the Word of God is the only thing that, and for good reason, it's not like it wasn't for good reason, but to split off the visual and the embodied from text, that is a very strange move in terms of the human being. And that move is why it's possible for us to even talk about a world of human beings that don't have art.
Yeah, that's what I was referring to when I said earlier that, you know, the artist and the priest have always been one. And also in societies where spirituality is much more interwoven with everyday life, people are creating art just as a part of the process of living, but they're not necessarily calling themselves artists, and the priests aren't necessarily calling themselves, oh, I'm the artist of this group, I'm the artist of the society, but it's just, that's what we would term art, looking from our culture in, we have separated into it. Oh, art is these objects, it's these things you hang on the wall, it's the stuff that you can sell, it's the stuff that, you listen to and it makes you feel something, it makes you cry. But I think that is, it's because we have segmented so much of our lives into different things and put spirituality in one and art in another and regular work and family life in an, and it's all like segmented into different things. So it makes it seem like objectively they are all different things. But I don't think that they are. I think that they're all connected. And I think that, yeah, we've never seen a society throughout history that didn't have, what we today would call art, all the way going back to the cave paintings, from
You just wouldn't have people. Like it wouldn't be like, is there art or not art? You just wouldn't have people. The question, like if you want to ask questions about where do forms of expression thrive versus not thrive? The irony is like something like the Renaissance is not a time any of us would want to be in. Like people might say, oh, I want to go back to when, Michelangelo's painting the Sistine Chapel. Like, no, you wouldn't, because half the population of Florence had recently died from the plague and Italy was going through several civil wars. Like it was not a time that anybody right now would want to be a part of. Like Petrarch, who's one of like the initial humanists of the Renaissance, like there's no framework for what he wants to do. And people don't get that. Most people don't realize the Renaissance was a horrific, like very tumultuous time, right? So, and art tends to, and I don't even like the term art, even though I'm in art history. Part of my project is to actually undo a lot of these Western frameworks that we have for art and move actually toward other frameworks, non-Western frameworks that exist and have existed for millennia, and maybe like pre-Enlightenment, pre-Reformation frameworks that exist around the forms of modes of expression. But what I was going to say is, usually when you see explosions of art, it's not this idea of it exists in these times of peace. It usually exists in times of profound turmoil, specifically because it's communication.
Yeah.
When you're in danger, the need to communicate becomes absolutely essential, and you've got to get rid of all the fluff, and you have to communicate what exactly you need and what it is that you mean.
Yeah.
And at those moments, you look at the Renaissance, you can look at World War II, right? World War I and World War II, the Civil War in America. You have like profound right before the Civil War and right after American art experiences its kind of influx of creativity or inspiration, and especially around the wars. But when you really look at this work, you really look at something like Mark Rothko, or you look at the work of Anselm Kiefer, like it's deeply disturbing. It's people are grappling with things they need to find language as a mode of catharsis and a mode of like moving out of what they've seen and experienced. It operates as some form of sacrifice. And that's not to say that that's what every form of art has to do. But it is to say that often what we recognize as being the most impactful and eloquent and articulate forms of expression usually emerge during these times when people are being pressed to their limits.
Yeah, man, I'm even really being convicted of myself as you're talking, because I think, and I don't think I'm alone in this, where I have often thought that, or had this feeling that due to the circumstances or the trials or the strife in my life, I have to get over those things before I can then create art. But oftentimes what you're talking about is very often the strife and the trial and the conflict is what is the birth of the artistic expression that then leads to the beautiful painting or the amazing film or whatever that might be. And that shows up, I mean, in history.
Yeah, I mean, and then this brings in another question, like, is it that beautiful things are being created, or is it that we use the word beautiful because they give us language and voice for things we didn't have before? I think this is a common misperception. Like, people want to see beautiful things, and like I've seen many Christians talk about beauty without recognizing that beauty has a lot less to do with some kind of Hollywood movie star who's really sexy than it does with something so viscerally articulate that it gives me language for the invisibilized places within my being. It visibilizes the invisible. That capacity to give articulation to the ineffable, that is what we often talk about as beautiful. And that doesn't necessarily always coincide with nice feeling things
or aesthetics.
Or so I think that's this other part. And even go back to your, I completely relate to you. I want to be in a more comfortable situation to do whatever. But if we think about it, if I'm not developing language or the necessary techniques or tools to engage with difficult circumstances, usually when I'm in better circumstances, what am I then creating? I'm kind of creating like basically this whipped cream on a cake. Like, it's not necessary. It's just nice. And we often recognize, well, that's where this whole term of selling out comes from, right? Like, people reach the top and then they kind of like lose, not everyone, but oftentimes the impulse, the recognition that what they're doing is actually producing language for things that remain ineffable. That kind of necessity that means you need it everywhere. And that is what I want to see. I want to see things that are produced that are necessary everywhere, not things that are produced by privileged individuals who, they kind of can do with it or without it. And like, basically, I hope that some really rich patron can, take this off my hands so I get more money. Like, that kind of production of meaning, which is very present in every moment of the industry, going all the way back to the Greeks. That's present everywhere and in every culture. Artisans who just produce for the sake of patrons who want to see particular things. But what we're talking about is something a little bit different. And I think spirituality provides us with good language for what that is. And that's why I would say it's more than art or artisanship.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you this. I think many people often now attribute art to influence and notoriety, specifically, like, I mean, with TikTok stars rising up overnight, it's almost a get rich quick scheme in many regards, or winning the lottery. If you just make this little piece of something, you make this 8-second video, you could be on the front page of who knows where in the morning. Is that type of attributing art and art with influence and notoriety, is that a new concept kind of with the digital age, or has that existed for a while?
I mean, Rembrandt was super famous and rich, and the stuff he made was like absurdly successful. I think you've always had artists that this kind of tension between fame and artistry. But if you go back to the Greeks, artisans were considered to be like some of the lowest totem pole of society. They kind of they crafted the idols, but they were consistently talked about in texts as being just like people you wouldn't. It was like a caste system for the Greeks, and artists were definitely very low on the totem pole. So even though they were acting in this space of priests, they were not necessarily appreciated at that time. So the relationship between fame and artwork, I mean, these are all really tricky, right? Because fame means something very specific to our moment in time right now, and it means something very specific to a capitalist society. And people would even argue, is that even artistry, or is that like capitalism being given this like mouth and arms and eyes and ears. I mean, I don't mean to be super crude, but like in many ways, what you're seeing is an expression of capitalism that somebody like Marx or Max Weber would have talked about, in terms of like, you're basically engaging with the manipulation of desire within the human being. So is that really art, or is it just like, I know that your chemical impulses are working in this way? I mean, this is the way much of AI works. It's like pattern recognition. So in recognizing that desire is produced through these sort of mechanisms, I'm going to produce desire through the technical mechanisms available to me at this moment in time to extract the most amount of attention, which then translates immediately into capital. And so if I'm able to do that, then awesome. Is that artistry? Sure, there's like a certain artistry in extraction. You have to be pretty creative. Does that connect me to larger truths about, again, going back to this original idea of myself, others, and the world around me, art operating as this theater for beholding otherness? Is that what's happening? Nah, sure. Any interaction between two humans, or human and a non-human, or two non-humans, is a form of communication. So yeah, it meets those requirements, but does it open me up to deeper and more profound dialogue with myself, others, and the world around me? I don't think so. It actually becomes more constraining. I lose more and more of a sense of myself, others, and the world around me, or that my sense of those things becomes so controlled and calibrated by these, not just the single interaction, but it's the accumulation of those interactions, right? Like, those people operating in this space are not operating just for themselves. They're operating within the kind of framework that space, prescribes for them.
I think it's complicated because a lot of people who are making stuff to get more views or to get more money, some of those people are pursuing fame and fortune and not pursuing art. And sometimes while they're pursuing fame and fortune and instrumentalizing, their talent for art in the process, art does get made. It's kind of like how you can like be doing drugs and like you can encounter Jesus while you're doing drugs, but like that's not like the best way to encounter Jesus. It just can happen sometimes. And so I think, yeah, sometimes you're pursuing fame and fortune and art can happen. Other times people are feel like they need to be in that kind of grind of trying to get more views and trying to create more stuff that's going to get them attention, because they genuinely don't have other ways to support themselves and make money so that they can do the art that they want to do. So it's tough, and I'm not, I wouldn't judge someone who's like a TikTok influencer or who's trying to become one.
Right.
But I would say what I would always advocate for is, as Christians, to not feel like we need to go along with those trends or with those kind of tried and true methods of the world to get where we think we need to get. I think that as Christians, our art should be really inseparable from our relationship with God. And we should, it's not that a Christian should or shouldn't, make stuff that's really popular and try to figure out what's popular. But it's also not that a Christian should do those things just because everybody else is doing those things and that's how you get successful. I think that we really need to be listening to God and be asking ourselves, like, okay, am I being honest with myself? Am I being true to, the things that I feel called to do, and to the stuff that's inside of me that's trying to come out or that I'm trying to grapple with? And am I going for that? Am I going in the direction of, deeper honesty and vulnerability and surrender? And if that if going in that direction leads you to make a bunch of those balloon dogs that Jeff Koons makes, then make the balloon dogs, you know? And if it leads you in the direction to make a bunch of things that nobody understands, or to, you know, I know you've talked to Joel and Sharon about their journey, and like, you know, they've felt led to not promote their music, right? And people would, in the music industry, would be like, that's so, like, I'm sorry, but you know, if you don't promote yourself, then you're never going to get out there. Like, your music will not be known. But if that's that, going towards honesty, vulnerability, and surrender is leading them to do that, then that's what they've got to do. Whereas another person, God might lead them to, you know, send their, this is like such a dated example, like send their demo tapes to everyone, and, you know, get signed with a big record label. Like, then that's what they're supposed to do. But we just have to be very careful not to put another template onto our lives just because it's worked for somebody else. I think that's like actually a surefire way to disaster. You know, it's like you look throughout the Bible, and any time the Israelites were like, well, these other nations are getting success doing this, and like technically God told us not to do that, or he didn't tell us anything, and we're not going to ask him, we're just going to do that tried and true method, like it usually leads to something really bad. And every time something really great happens for them, it's because they asked God and he led them to do something that they wouldn't have thought of themselves, or they wouldn't have expected, or in a way that they wouldn't have thought of or expected. And I think it has to be like that for us as artists as well.
I would say one other thing, like, we need to be very, very careful as believers about this idea of fame, because where does it come from? It's very much linked to a colonial and capitalist enterprise in which you're looking to extract and extract it. And we live in like an attention economy right now. So you're looking to extract attention for the sake of capital. So we need to just be asking questions about, like, is that how I should be operating? Like,
What is the heart behind it?
Yeah, are those the logics that I'm going to plug into? And I mean, we see it all the time. I'm a theoretician and an academic. Like, so many Christians, so many like platforms are just adopting the logics of attention economy and then trying to exploit it and extract with it. And you know what? You're not going to do it probably as well as the people that devised it, because it's a completely inhuman system. So, and if you do it as well, and there are Christians who have done it as well, you wind up seeing what happens and what kind of people they really are, because it just winds up being like, oh, you're just like everybody else. You actually don't have any morals or moral framework. You might have some ethics, but they kind of, what you're doing runs counter to the logics of Christianity at its core. You haven't asked the questions necessary to kind of allow you to navigate that space with any sort of integrity.
Yeah, so I think this is a perfect way to kind of round out this conversation. I mean, talking about what is art and what is the artist and the role of the artist, and the language of art. Christina, we had a brief conversation on the phone leading up to this, and one of the things that you mentioned was the sentiment that we don't need to play by the same rules. I think that might be a kind of a good way to kind of round out this conversation, talking about, like, there's all these things that everybody is professing and telling us to do, and this is how it is supposed to be, and the gatekeeping, and just so much noise. But what did you mean kind of by that, as people of faith, that we don't need to play by the same rules?
Yeah, I would even say that we definitely should not play by the same rules. And I think this is what I meant earlier about, like, it's really kind of disastrous to take a template, the world's template, and put it onto ourselves, because so much of the world is operating in a way that is, there's no acknowledgement of God, much less a dependence on him. And I think that dependence on God is not something that like you can take it or leave it, and your life will like be slightly better if you depend on God. But if you don't, like it'll still be okay too. I think that when people don't acknowledge or depend on God, really horrible things happen. Like we end up treating each other in horrible ways and doing things to ourselves that are so destructive. And so I think that, I'm not one of those people that is like Hollywood is evil or whatever, but I do acknowledge and I do believe that the systems, so many of the systems of our world are anti the kingdom of God and anti the person of Christ in the way that they operate. I used to work in law. I used to work in big law, corporate America. And the way that it operates by default is to treat people as expendable and to reward you if you act like a robot, and basically like to dehumanize people for the sake of making as much money as possible. Like that is an anti-kingdom way. It's an anti-kingdom system. And so if we go into those places and we're like, okay, I just need to get successful so that I can show others how great God is and I can be a witness when I'm at the top, then we've lost before we've even started. Those examples that people always point to, Daniel, Esther, Joseph, right? In the Bible, like none of those people got to those high places of influence. None of them were trying to get to those places. They were all forced into those situations. And God then kind of, allowed them to be in this place of influence, but they were not trying to get there. And in fact, once they got to those places, I mean, especially Daniel and Esther, right? Like they did what you're really not supposed to do in order to keep on climbing or in order to secure their spot. They really kept on doing these things that were going to put them in danger and make them very vulnerable, because they were trying to serve God and trying to do the right thing and playing by a totally different set of rules. And that is what made them so influential in a good way. And I think, yeah, as artists, I went to law school after college. I worked as a lawyer for a few years, and God brought me on this journey to where, like, in my mid 30s, I realized that I wanted to be a writer instead. And, so now I'm like trying to write and trying to, figure out, okay, how can I find my voice? How can I get better at my craft? How can I, find ways to do this sustainably? And I'm always just like, why didn't I just go and do an MFA when I was in my 20s? Like, that's what everybody does. That's what you're supposed to do. Like, you're not supposed to be in your 30s and be like, oh, I decided I want to be a writer. And now, like, let me try to now go apply for an MFA. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, why did I even go to law school? Right. So like from the world's perspective, I really just did this like the wrong way. And my life just went on a mistaken trajectory. And yet, like, I can't make that judgment on my life. Like I've always done what I felt the Lord was leading me to do. And at the time in my 20s, it was law school. And then a few years later, it was for us to stop working completely for, 2 years. And, all this inner work was happening to us. And it was a very difficult thing that we went through. And then at the end of that process, God kind of led me to pursue creative writing. And so, if I look at the rules of the world of like what you're supposed to do in order to become, a writer, to make it as a writer, then I just feel like I have very little to no chance. But I can't think about life that way. Like I have to just keep doing what I feel God has called me to do, and just trust that he's going to take me where I'm supposed to go, where he wants me to go. And maybe that's as a successful writer with, many published books, going on book tours and getting my books made into movies. And maybe it's that I'll, hopefully write some stuff that I'm proud of and that I feel really good about. And that, a much fewer number of people read. And like either way, I think that, in order to have any real integrity as an artist, like I just have to pursue the path set before me by the Lord, and just trust the process, and not try to like not try to jerry rig like a system that's gonna get me to success the way I've seen others get to success, because I think it's very toxic for your soul to do something like that. And you might be successful. I think a lot of people do find fame and fortune and success by playing by the world's rules, and it's very toxic to their souls. And there's so many examples, like I don't need to list any of them. I think we all can think of so many people, and that's not what we want as believers, because we know that like, life is so short and it's not worth it to get those things. It's the classic gain the world and lose your soul. And I think that what art is about is about, surrendering your soul and your inmost being to something larger, so that like through you, God can create something that's like so much that's you and that's beyond you. And I think that that's when art is at its most, amazing, is that when you're like, oh my gosh, I made that, and yet it's so much more than what I ever could have done.
Yeah.
We're not saying like that success or recognition is mutually exclusive with the act of making art. I know it probably sounds like that because of the way I talk, but what we are trying to communicate, I think, is that art is a project of, and again, I know that I don't love using the term art, but for the sake of clarity, art is a project in which we pursue wisdom. And that is very different. And wisdom will always run counter to the logics of any society and culture. The wisdom of God will always be higher, stranger, weirder than what is easily accessible. And so that project, and that's a very particular, the commitment to that calling means a life of all kinds of sacrifice, while it also might mean a life of that might appear to some as being extravagant, but it's, being in my space in academia, like I don't, again, similarly, like not the same trajectory as people would normally take to do what I'm doing. But again, like if the goal is wisdom and intimacy with the person of Christ and the Holy Spirit and God, then that looks very, very different. And the work I make and the things I write and the engagements I move into are unorthodox, but they also are not going to rely upon our own wisdom or our own understanding of a situation. It's continual dependence and it's continual reliance on the wisdom of God, and figuring out, how do I communicate that wisdom? How do I communicate, and how do I communicate this journey, right? The journey, when we read people's journeys in scripture, they're so weird and messy. They're not how we would script them.
Yeah.
Make your weird stuff, be yourself, listen to God, don't try to get famous. The end.
Well, I was going to ask you guys if you wanted to leave anybody with anything as we kind of close out here, but I think all of that just sums it up so perfectly.
Exactly.
And I feel my heart also responding to it as well, as an artist, as somebody who makes art. Just I resonate with all of that. So again, thank you so much for all of your time and just the immense amount of wisdom that you brought. I have been truly touched by the words that you've shared today. I do want to leave just with, I'm going to do the promo. You probably wouldn't do yourself, but I'm going to do it. If you want to read something that has been written by these two wonderful people, the Mestizo Archipelago is a book that literally dives into the history of art in LA. And it's just chock full of diagrams and breakdowns and even just like really personal quotes by artists in LA all over that have been here for 5 years, who've been here for 50 years. So if you do want to check out something, the Mestizo Archipelago, you'll learn about what that means in the book. You just got to read it. But Christina and Christian, thank you guys so much for jumping on today and having this conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the LCJ podcast. We hope that this conversation blessed you. If you want to know more, please look in the description for more links and follow the Expression 58 socials to keep up to date on what we're doing. If you'd like to support the creation of this podcast, please consider donating. Visit expression58.org/podcasts for more information. We'll see you next time.